another night for Supernatural Girlz. Real stories, real answers to life's biggest supernatural mysteries. And now for another exciting interview with paranormal experts from this world and others. Here's your host, paranormal researcher Patricia Baker, on the one, the only Supernatural Girlz.
Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of Supernatural Girlz Radio. I'm your host, Patricia Baker, and I am here with my co-host, the fabulous Patricia Kirkman, PK. How you doing, PK?
Oh, just melting. It's beautiful.
Oh, must
feel
be
so
nice.
spoiled. Feel so spoiled.
Gosh, it's beautiful. How lucky you are. Well, we got a lot to talk about tonight. We have a terrific guest. This is a man I've wanted to talk to for many years. Follow us on Twitter. We've got Melissa tweeting away. You don't want to miss any of the stuff she has to say, any of the stories that she's tweeting. So make sure you follow us there as well. And, of course, we have our newsletter, The Fringe Files.
Yes.
Sign up on our website, supernaturalgirlz.com, and you will get all the latest and greatest news right from us, just once a week. We're not going to clog up your email. So just go ahead and sign up there. And again, follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. So here's what we got. We got some creepy sounds in the sky.
Yes, we do.
And they are creepy indeed. Now, people have been reporting these all over the world, but this time it's coming from the UK. And if you go to our Facebook page, you'll be able to play the sounds and listen to them and make your own determination on what in the world they are. But all these sounds kind of have the same feel to them, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. That's what was very unusual. The sameness and yet different.
Now, I have an intern that's working with us. We have several, and Michaela Wallace is her name. And she sent me some sound bites from Westfield, Massachusetts. And these sounds are the same sounds that we're hearing in Plymouth in the UK.
I'll be darned. Oh.
Yes. So I'm going to load those up tomorrow so you can all listen to them. Go back to the Facebook page tomorrow. You'll be able to hear them. It's the same stuff. And she said it's the weirdest thing. She doesn't know where the sounds are coming from, but they sound very much like the UK sounds. So they're right in our own backyard now.
Well, they say they're a little bit of everywhere, and yet they're the same sound. That's what's the worst or worldly part of it, is it's so different, but the same.
Yes, it's like showing up in different places, but it's the same sound. And nobody can say exactly where it's coming from. Some people say, oh, it's just a train, and it's the way the hills are, and it bounces. No, it's not. It's not at all that.
It's one heck of an echo if it goes around the world.
I know, that's right. Now, the other story we have, and you're definitely going to want to go to our Facebook page to check this out. There is a skull, a photograph of a skull on Mars. It looks like a Martian to me. What do you think?
Well, it could. It's got that look. It almost looks like the head from a temple.
Yes.
Would they have one of the people
it definitely looks alien. It doesn't look human. It looks like an alien skull. Whether it's more reptilian or not, I can't see from the photograph, but it is very, very unusual.
Well, it definitely has a strange look to it, and it's so strange is how light it is at the top.
Yes. So y'all got to go check this out. It's very, very unusual. I think there's a lot of life on Mars. A lot of stuff's going on Mars and on the moon. They're just not coughing up the truth here, but we know.
They don't want us to know anything.
They sure don't, but we know anyways. They can't cover it up anymore. We're just not going to allow it. That's all there is to it.
That's
so here's this skull. And like you said, the more I look at it, you're right. It does look like a temple head.
Yeah, almost
indeed.
Like a statue, the head of.
Yes, or a helmet.
Oh, good point.
Yeah, could be a helmet. We want to hear what you think. So leave us a comment on the Facebook.
Yes, definitely.
Tell us what you think this is. It could be all of the above. I don't know. But it is worth a look. Worth a look for sure. And also don't forget to visit our advertisers. We have the highend.org, Ezra, who is the expert for medical marijuana. He's got some very high-quality CBD oil products, which are legal in all 50 states. And he is the man to consult with. If you have a medical issue and you want to use some form of marijuana for pain, sleep, or recovery, then he's the one to talk to about it. He's on our webpage. You can click right on his link and go to his website, and you'll see what he has to offer. Give him a call. He's, again, a wealth of information, and he's just terrific. You can't go wrong with him. And we also have Tom Palladino. He is from creativestrength.us. Now, he's offering everybody who wants to do this a 15-day free scalar treatment. You don't have to give a credit card, nothing, just a photograph. You can send it in right from the link, creativestrength.us, and you'll get a free 15-day scalar treatment. Very cool. So check it out. And then last but not least, we have lots of books on our website, which are excellent. And one of them is the latest and greatest UFO abduction case by Sean Bartok, Flashbacks. So take a look at all those wonderful things on our website, and you won't be disappointed. They're all terrific. So tonight, we are talking about the weirdest stuff, the greatest paranormal stories with one of the best. Paul Eno is here with us tonight. Now, Paul is best known because for his father-son co-hosting. Now, his son Ben is going to join us a little bit later. They have been co-hosting CBS Radio and WOON 1240, Boston, Worcester, Providence. And the name of their radio show is Behind the Paranormal, with an estimated 3 million listeners. But with a combined 55 years of experience as paranormal researchers, they are far more than talk show hosts. So Paul was one of the first paranormal investigators of the early 1970s, beginning while he was studying for the priesthood. We got to find out more about this.
That's for sure. They don't seem to mix, but they've mixed beautifully.
For him, they did. So his early mentors included parapsychology pioneer Dr. Louisa Rhine, Father John J. Nicola. He was technical advisor for the film The Exorcist, by the way, and legendary first-generation ghost hunters Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now, Paul graduated from 2 seminaries, but he was expelled from a third because of his paranormal work with less than 2 years to go before ordination. So he ended up as an award-winning New England journalist and the author of 5 books on the paranormal and 2 books on history. Now, let me tell you something. This new book, you and I both read it, Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, is their latest book. It's a great book, everybody.
It is fabulous, just fabulous.
We loved it. So now we got to get this guy in the show, right? Paul, welcome to the show.
Well, good evening, ladies.
Good evening.
Happy to have you with us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
Now, first and foremost, you got to fill us in on the priest thing.
Oh.
What's going on with this?
It really goes way back to really when I was 7, I suppose. And as you can imagine, it took a long time to be able to talk about this. But at that age, I was witness to my father's suicide.
Oh, my God.
Goodness.
Yes, exactly. And my brother was already in the seminary, my older brother. And as time went by, I was in this really strict Roman Catholic school. And if you ate a hot dog on Friday or committed suicide, you would go to hell. And fortunately, one of the nuns, there were some who I think were potential axe murderers, and there were some who were saints. And fortunately, in 2nd grade, I had one of the saints. So she got me through this by saying essentially, in so many words, God is kind of bigger than all that. So that really helped. So as time went by, I entered the seminary myself at the age of 14, when you could still do that.
Goodness.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting because I was, in the back of my mind was what happened to my father. Now, they teach you the usual things. At that level, you're like, it's like high school, so you're learning that stuff. And, they're not teaching you about eschatology just yet, the final things, what happens when you die and what
Right.
the ultimate fate of the world be, all that business. And sometimes they don't teach you that at all, I don't think, anymore. So what would happen would be that by 1970, I had encountered an article in the Hartford Courant newspaper about this really strange place in northeast Connecticut. And it was an old man who was one of these people you find in many old New England towns there, historians who knew what everybody's cousin did in the 1700s and all this sort of stuff. And, and he knew about this place, and the article was about his experiences there, and he had a number of interesting photos he'd taken in the 40s and 50s, et cetera, et cetera. So he said, well, why don't I go try this and see if this is souls in purgatory, right? That's how I started. So we went out there, we being a number of other seminary students and a photo expert, and from several times from 71 to 72 into 72. And we got into things that just were so bizarre that had nothing to do with any of the old theories. But as far as the seminary is concerned, I got involved with Ed and Lorraine Warren in 1972. Lorraine read something I'd written about this purgatory theory, thought it was cool, and I worked with them until about 78. But in 77, I was in the Orthodox seminary in New York, and I was maybe a year or two before ordination. And in that church, you have to pretty much be married before you're ordained, or else forever hold your peace. And but I still think I don't know. They didn't like this at all. They threw me out, and they didn't even want to talk to me.
Oh my gosh! Just get out, huh?
Well, exactly. They should have my nose in my books, and that was all there was to it. So there I was, had nothing and didn't know what to do. And I ended up a journalist because the only other thing I could do was write, I guess. And only one paper in New England wanted to talk to me. And the New England Association of Editors called it the worst daily paper in New England. So that's how I got my start in journalism. With this hideous editor who made Perry White look like Mother Teresa. And it was, but boy, did I learn. And I've been in journalism ever since. So I had a lucky escape on that one. Maybe the church did too. So that's the story behind that.
Yes. Oh,
fabulous.
My. An interesting beginning to all of these things.
For a dull moment.
Oh, I guess. Now, you've had quite the adventure as a paranormal researcher and a radio host. And from your book, it looks like you've really delved into just about everything over the years. Do you have a favorite story?
From the book?
From anything in your experience. You can go beyond the book if you want.
The favorite story might be probably the scariest thing that ever happened to me. And that's in the section about ghosts and poltergeists. I think that's chapter 4. And that has to do with the Bridgeport poltergeist outbreak, as I call it, of 1974. And I was working with the Warrens on that. And at one point in this 3-day case, I was standing with the little girl in the living room of this house. And it was a really my first knockdown, drag-out poltergeist case. And I was still in the seminary. And these 4 of these things, and I got the impression, we thought these were demons. Officially, that was my training, and the Warrens thought so too, and we were waiting for the Bishop of Bridgeport to give permission for an exorcism, but none of that felt right. It didn't feel like that was good enough. But sure enough, Monday night, the Warrens weren't there. They were out doing some radio interview. And out come these 4 things from the girl's bedroom through the kitchen, up the hallway, and into the living room. And when I say things, you could feel, just like if we were in the same room together, we could feel each other's presence. Well, there were 4 of these things. You could almost see these gauzy structures. 3 of them kind of circulated around the living room, and one of them came over to where I was standing, and I put the little girl behind me because that was my job during the case, was to see if she was doing any of these things herself, because we had floating refrigerators. I witnessed this in the presence of police officers and firefighters and all this business. And the thing came up to me, and this is where I learned you do not get angry or annoyed with these things because they'll feed on it. I just instinctively kind of pushed against it. It pushed back. Now, these things are supposed to be spirits.
Right.
This thing was perfectly physical.
Wow.
Couldn't really see it very well. And I could even feel kind of a skeletal structure.
Ugh.
I was so taken aback and floored. And the thing got around me and threw the little girl across the room. At that point, the energy in there was so strong, I pulled everybody out of the house. Fortunately, the police had cordoned off the street. There's a little street in Bridgeport, and there had been several thousand people gathered outside this. There are news photographs of that. And so we didn't walk out in the middle of a crowd. Then this is long before cell phones in '74, so I had to go to a neighbor's house to call the Warrens and ask them to come back into the city. And something followed me, was knocking on the door and all this business. And finally, after an hour, because there was so much traffic from this thing, they got back. And but that incident, the experience of physically tangling with what I now call a parasite, that I thought at the time was a demon, which is, what's the cliche? It rocked my world. And all.
Yes,
and it wasn't fun.
The questions that started in this case in Northeast Connecticut, that first one, were simply exacerbated by this case in 1974. And by the end of the 70s, I was just totally confused by what I was running into. Ghosts of people who weren't dead. People running into ghosts of themselves. Talking to people who had experiences of buildings or even whole towns that were there one minute, gone the next. They had dinner and they came out, went back the next day, and the place was gone. I mean, what the hey is this?
Yeah.
I mean, and it didn't match any of the old ideas at all. And that really, so that thing in that Bridgeport house probably was the craziest thing that ever happened.
Why did you use excuse me, Patricia, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, why you use the term parasites for them?
Well, we look at our own very narrow paradigm, and we see things that we think our minds can comprehend, and we put labels on them that I early on came to the conclusion were just not right. For example, you see Uncle Bob skipping down the street a year after his funeral, okay? And so it's got to be, well, maybe it is. Yeah, you have to, and you think, well, it's got to be the spirit of Uncle Bob, or it's got to be his remnant, or it's a residual haunting or something. And because we don't, what else could it be? We don't know any other explanation unless we get in to quantum mechanics, which in some of its interpretations by some physicists could very readily explain this. But as we say, one of our slogans of our show is explaining the paranormal is not the problem. It's handling the explanations. So we made, and so with the parasite thing, we were assuming, okay, demons, evil spirits, servants of Satan trying to, jerk you around and all this business. But when you look at how they reacted, particularly that one in that Bridgeport house, that thing fed on the anger, and it got stronger and stronger, because I was angry because I was trying to protect the child. It got stronger and stronger. And since then, my son, and then later on Ben, would notice this invariably. You tell people, Ben and I call it the Peter Pan theory. When you think happy thoughts, it repels these things, as they seem to be unable to feed upon positive energy, whatever that may mean. So as far as the term parasite, I think we're dealing with perfectly physical, about 9 different species or so, perfectly physical creatures that seem to be. And here's where the multiverse comes in, the idea of multiple parallel worlds. So we're used to thinking of a material world and a spirit world, right? But that's two-dimensional. I think we've got many, perhaps an infinite number of parallel worlds, because what does quantum physics in some of its incarnations say? It says that all possibilities actually exist somewhere or somewhen in the multiverse. In other words, what's the old time paradox? You go back in time in a time machine and you shoot your own grandfather. How could you be born? Well, that's not how it apparently works. If you go back and shoot your own grandfather, then the world in which you're doing that would continue without you. But the world in which you were born, the world family stream, as we call it, would be unchanged. You've simply created another branch of the universal tree of the world. And so this essentially gives us many parallel realities. So what do the parasites seem to do? They seem to feed sometimes, life is tenacious. Why can't there be life between worlds as well as in them. And we've seen on many occasions parasites feeding on a negative event happen. It might not even be humans. It might be completely alien in a very broad sense of the term, and then reaching into another world and feeding on something else. We ran into that in the haunted policeman case of Vermont. Okay, there was this is one of Ben's first two cases, starting in 2005 when he was 13, and these there were two folks, and their son was a police officer in the local community, and lived in the basement apartment under their house. And when he said that they were being bothered by something very negative, and that they would sometimes see it, and I would say, well, when he and his, I explained it the way I'm explaining it to you, and he said when he and his fiance would fight, that's when they would see it. It would be almost solid. It would walk through the apartment, sometimes knock things over, and we actually got a photograph of this thing. And actually, Ben did. I was afraid to show it to him, but he's cool with all this. It's like he said, "Oh, it's cool. So it looks like one of the Black Riders from Lord of the Rings, right?" Which it did. So what was going on in the yard? We first got out of the car. The first time that we were drawn right to this spot in the yard, and something apparently very negative is happening there in a parallel reality. Probably, I spent some time out there, several hours at night. Got the impression it was a fight going on between two men. One killed the other, but it wasn't even happening in our world. It might be in the future, because none of this means anything in the sense of past to future. It's all simultaneous. Einstein pretty much showed that in his 1952 book, Relativity. We just experience it in a linear manner from past to future. That's not really, because this does wonderful things for the idea of reincarnation, where there's no such thing as the past, but you have instead parallel lives. So this essentially is what a parasite would be. It's a life form that feeds across the boundaries of multiple parallel worlds. Many times we've seen this happening, and there was a case in if I may continue, there's a case in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania in 2004. Ben wasn't with me. He hadn't started yet. But you had a house in the outskirts of Philadelphia with a parasite feeding on a negative event in the backyard, a murder, I believe, bothering two girls who shared this apartment, and also bothering 4 people whom the girls thought were ghosts, who thought the girls were ghosts haunting them. Because how did they see them? They see them through the electromagnetically and plasma charged brains, BRANES as physicists call them, or membranes of parallel worlds. So naturally, you see somebody doing their thing over there, they're going to look like a ghost in our classic sense. So the parasite was feeding in both worlds at the same time on these unfortunate people, and it can be a real mess to untangle.
Well, that's my next question, Paul. Exactly that. How do you put a stop to that?
Well, it actually depends on the kind of parasite you're dealing with. One of the things you have to realize, Patricia, is that the people want you to come in and fix it. That's not how it works. You have to really people participate, and not only in the paranormal phenomena they experience, but really in everything in life. I mean, you're not, you don't have to sit there like a lump and things happen to you. So when it comes to a parasite sort of thing, especially in the upper echelons, as far as seriousness is concerned, like possession and things like that, as it's traditionally called, you have to very seriously have a sort of tacit agreement that this thing can kind of bother you, at least when you get up to that level. But generally, what you're dealing with here is the presence of too much negativity. Okay, you have to get the negative energy out to cut off the food supply. And you know who's very good at this? I don't know if he's ever been on your show, but he should be. Shane Searway, who is a Blackfoot shaman from New Hampshire, and also a very feet on the ground investigator. That's a very good combination, and he has like a 100% success rate with this, because he goes in, he has the number of these things. He knows what they really are. So what you want to do is cut off the food supply. So how do you do that? And of course, the people are as much of a problem sometimes as the phenomena, as the parasites. Very often we'll see, and there's always some reason why this is happening. People will come to me and say, "Oh, well, it started 2 years ago." That this thing we started to see it in the house, and then people started to argue, and the things got bad. I said, "Okay, well, what changed 2 years ago?" in your house or in your family? What is it that changed that would be feeding this thing? So you ask a whole bunch of little questions kind of in baby steps, and then go on to find out where the negativity is coming from. And it's almost always coming from the people because they are providing food and they are being farmed, for lack of a better term, sometimes by one parasite, sometimes by a group of them. And the parasites are very interesting creatures. They have leadership. They have a form of a culture. Some dominate others. It's really quite interesting. But sometimes there will be rogue feeders, almost like sharks, that they'll sit there. I had one time in 1998 that sat in a wall of a boy's room and was feeding upon the boy's mother, who was very much something of not an invalid, but someone who was very unemployed, homebound, very depressed, and feeding on that. And it was very difficult to disentangle because it had her convinced that it was a lover from a past life. She was writing love letters to the bloody thing.
Oh my God.
So to disentangle this stuff can be very difficult, but you do it with positive energy. You get the family to come together, and if they're scared enough, they will. Come together, be in solidarity, and you can use anything that's positive to do this. I once got rid of the worst poltergeist I ever dealt with.
Okay, hold that thought, Paul, because we have to take a very short break. But we're going to hear how you got rid of the worst one ever. And that is why we like to sit on the edge of our seats here during the commercial break, waiting for you to come back. So,
good for sure.
We are speaking with Paul Eno, and perhaps after the break, even Ben Eno will join us. And they are the authors of Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong. So, stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Supernatural Girlz Radio. I'm your host, Patricia Baker. I am here with my co-host, PK, and our terrific guest tonight. He is paranormal researcher extraordinaire and radio host, Paul Eno. And Paul, you were just about to tell us about how you got rid of the worst poltergeist ever, the worst parasite ever. How'd you do it?
Well, first, I hope I can live up to your beautiful introduction, but get rid of it using a joke book.
What? A joke book?
There had been 6 I should say, parasitical entities, in my opinion, in this house. Actually, it was a combination convenience store with an apartment above it for the owners, and this is in '79. And they had closed the store because of all the stuff going on. And the woman was rather smart about some of this. She had her cousin park his remodeler's van outside so she could tell customers that they were remodeling. So curtains down over the big windows and all. But actually, there had been a poltergeist attack that she'd sent her daughter to live with her sister. There was only one child, and she did all the worst things you can do. She had a seance. Which, of course, is this sledgehammer technique to come in and punch holes in the fabric of the multiverse, and heaven only knows who's going to come in. She did Ouija boards. She did this. She did that. The medium said, this is the angry ghost of somebody who was here in 1820 and was killed. I mean, the thing was a cornfield in 1820. I mean, I don't know. So then... But these things had pretty much run their course, at least in this particular case. So I came in and said, bring in positive energy, which can include humor. And I always told my two sons, laugh, but not at each other. Keep it positive. So we came in, and this friend of mine who called me in on the case, who's today a priest, and the woman and the daughter came, and we had a pleasant dinner. We yucked it up all evening with this joke book, and the thing was never seen or heard from again.
Wow.
For heaven's sakes.
I mean, there are different approaches that work.
Yes, and all this positive energy thrown at it, it seems to, like you say, dissuade it, and it's not what it's after. So it's not the food source it wants, and it goes away. How nice.
Yeah, well, effectively. Well, I wish we were all that easy, but very often you find that people never tell you everything. You've always got the kid in the basement using a Ouija board or doing something negative, or one of the daughters who's all, completely ostracized from the family or cuts herself up. This is all stuff that has to be dealt with before you can deal with any kind of phenomenon like this.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, they're all having its effect. Now, we've got a couple questions for you from the chat room. And this is from one of our listeners from down under, Para Abnormal. He says, hello, girls. Does Paul know anything about the Virgin Mary's story of the Coogee Virgin? It's pretty well known here in Australia.
Oh, we have a lot of listeners in Australia, too. I'm afraid I have to say that I don't.
Yeah, I've never heard of that either. Okay.
Yeah. He's invited to write to us. Our website, behindtheparanormal.com, has a million different links to our email. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah.
There's always something, I don't know about you when you went on the air, but we've been on the air almost 10 years, and it's like, gee, what are we going to talk about? We're going to run out of things. That has never happened. Yeah. We don't have enough shows to talk about all the things that come up.
That's right. We feel the same way. There's so much. Well, thank you, Para Abnormal, for that question. And please feel free to write to Paul and to us and fill us in. And this question is from Kalatu, who's asking, can Paul please elaborate more about the distinction between the types of feeding parasites? I think you started to touch on that, especially whether some people interpret them as aliens when someone else may describe them as a demon.
Very good question. Extremely good question, because working now off and on with Kathy Marden, who was well known from the Free group, and also the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, written a number of books with Stanton Friedman. And she would we met at a few conferences, and she would keep running into people who were having abductions, but then poltergeist stuff would be going on in their house, and you never could tell what was what. And so we've been consulting on some of that, and that is very true. It's just, again, our limited paradigm, and the labels we put on things aren't necessarily what's really happening. So that's you have to get in there and sort of discern what's really going on. However, and I will say that in that Bridgeport house, when I was dealing with those 4 different entities, I felt that they were, and I can't think of a better word, than alien. Now, I'm not saying they were from some other planet. And of course, in ensuing years, when Bill Hall interviewed me for his book, The World's Most Haunted House, I said, go out there and see if you can find other things that were going on in the area at the time, because it's never one house, it's never one family, it's always the whole area. And if you can talk to the neighbors, if they'll talk to you, you'll almost invariably find they've had weird things happen too. So sure enough, there were UFO sightings, more than, because again, this is many years ago, but there were a lot of things going on in that regard. Now, I'm not saying they were from another planet, but they filled the bill of, they were utterly other, different, certainly not human.
Not human, right.
So again, alien. But I don't know if he wants me to go through all 9 species of these things, but they sort of go from what I actually call them the wise, all the way down to kind of Dumb and Dumber, and very often I think they have their own societies. I think that they may be from different worlds, but they have been known to work together. The wise are like, and wise not in a good sense, but in the ways of their own species. That was the one who lived in the wall in Pasco, Rhode Island in 1998. And that was, they work alone, and they learn very quickly about us. And then there were the elders, as I call them. And they don't seem as interested in humans and human life as the wise do, except, of course, as food sources. There are the farmers. These parasites seem to work quietly, groups, I don't know, maybe 4 to 8, and will attach themselves to a human family, a tribe, or other community for long periods of time. And if you read the book, you realize that in Chapter 1, the paranormal and human history, and also some of the other chapters, you get into cases like the Bell Witch, where a whole community was essentially affected. And had it not been a 19th century Protestant community, these things, I think there were 6 of them, might have taken over, as I think they may have done in our remote past, when a bunch of our ancestors might have thought, oh, look what these things could do. They must be gods. I think so. There's that aspect.
Exactly.
There are pack hunters, kind of like the velociraptors of the paranormal world. They're highly aggressive, highly provocative, and they usually concentrate on one human individual at a time. I think these are very common because they'll go from one person to another. In another case, I should say that another case in the same area of Rhode Island in 1998, I actually got a photograph of the parasite, and it looked like a plasma-charged thing with arms. And when we sort of trained the woman in the house who was the first target to be positive and to not let it do this, it went after the daughter. And they would then it couldn't get anybody because they'd become positive, and they'd hear it pacing up and down the hallway at night because it couldn't get anything to eat. So there's that sort of thing. There are the rogues, lone hunters, who operate. They very often come through the as I say, the sledgehammer techniques like Ouija boards and seances, and they're often responsible for poltergeist or possession cases, and they will pretend to be whatever they have to be to push your buttons so they can eat. One of the more interesting groups is the passives, as we call them. They're kind of second stringers. Sometimes they are under the domination of elders, and they will just sort of sit there like some of the undersea species will sit there and just wait for food to go by, and then they grab it, that kind of thing. There is
lazy ones, huh?
Yeah. There are. I don't know if you want me to go through all these. There are 9 different ones.
That's okay, but I think you've answered the question, and you've given Klaatu a good understanding of the differences among them. And now here's my question about them: are they all aware of each other? Are we the only ones that are clueless?
No. Actually, that's another good question because it gets into the nature of life in the multiverse. Each of these worlds apparently has slightly different laws of physics. So I'll give you an example, and this is really strange. And if anybody's a medium who's listening, you'd be very interested in this. When I was in the seminary in northern New York State, I graduated from 2 seminaries. The third one threw me out. But the second faculty I had was really quite sympathetic to this and put some confidence in me. And I was kind of moved by that. I was working with the diocesan exorcist in the Ogdensburg State Hospital because when, usually that would be, you wonder why that would happen. But when, the doctors and hospital staff are standing in a room and they've got a schizophrenic patient in bed and stuff starts flying off shelves on the other side of the room and they start seeing things, obviously it's something more than just schizophrenia, and no amount of antipsychotic drugs are going to solve this. So that's when they would call us in. So there would be some very frightening exorcist kind of things that would be going on that I was involved with just as an assistant. And there was at one point one of the hallways in one of the wards was considered to be kind of haunted, and the staff didn't like to be there at night. And it was a non-psychiatric ward. Because the state hospital, you'd have any indigent patients who would be able to come in there. One of the patients said she was a psychic medium. And I would talk to her, and she says, well, yeah, this hall is weird because there's a man, which she presumed was a ghost, waiting for his wife to pass, and he was going to take her home. Okay, standard spiritualist, feel-good kind of nice thing, and maybe she was right. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I just don't get the same impressions as other people. So I decided, okay, the chapel happened to be in that hallway. So I spent a lot of time in the chapel over the next few days, and then figured, well, I was a seminary student. Maybe that's why he's hanging out in the chapel. I should have been making pastoral visits. But I have a technique that I do not recommend to anyone else. It kind of happened by accident starting in the 1970s, and I gradually became used to it because, I don't trust any kind of contact because you never know what it really is. But I felt that at this point, around the mid-70s, I'd gotten some kind of handle on this. So make a long story short, and I never try to contact them. I always let them, I sit in a meditative state, let them contact me. And very often they're afraid. They think I'm a ghost, but not in this case. The man was waiting for his wife, but he was waiting at the railroad station across the St. Lawrence River in Prescott, Ontario, Canada. And she was coming in from Montreal, and he was going to take her home. Simple as that, except that he lived in a very similar parallel world where it was normal The physics and their awareness was different, and they could talk to neighbors, as he called them, people like us, not only from the next house, but from the next world. And so ever since then, I've called neighbors these people, or sometimes very far from people you end up running into.
Sorry, I missed that.
So that was what that was, and I can see where the psychic medium would have thought the guy must be dead, because what else could he be? He's waiting for his wife. What else could it be that she's a patient and going to die there? But it was really an entirely different thing if I got it right. And ever since then, and actually some cases before that, it's been a whole new kind of world as far as the paranormal and contacts with neighbors, some of whom are very far from human, but very, very good. Others that are negative, such as parasites. It's all part of the same picture.
It is. And if you think of it, I guess how I think of it, to try to get my mind around it, is that it's all of these realities are like concentric circles, one around another. And then there are these portals that connect one to the next. And a lot of these parasites and entities know how to use those portals, and they come in and out of our reality at will. So that's how I see it, to try to understand it a little better. So I know you're helping us to get out of that linear thinking. So, but let me talk to you, because PK and I were talking about this, about one of our very favorite international cases, Dyatlov Pass.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That is the wildest story. There doesn't seem to be an answer to it, but please tell our listeners about Dyatlov Pass. I know some of them already have heard the story, but there's so much to it.
Yeah. Well, this happened in February of 1959 in the Ural Mountains of Russia, which at the time was, of course, part of the Soviet Union. And young people at the time were always encouraged to do outdoorsy stuff to become physically fit by the communist authorities, because if they had to go into the army, they'd know map reading and all stuff. They wouldn't have to bother teaching them. So there was a group of 9 students who set off under the leadership of this 23-year-old student named Igor Dyatlov, who ended up, unfortunately, having the pass named after him, but not because of anything good. They were from Sverdlovsk, which is today Ekaterinburg. In the Soviet times, it was Sverdlovsk. And they traveled up to, they were going to go to a mountain, which essentially was Mount Torten, which translated from the language of the indigenous people, it essentially means Mount Don't Go There. So I guess they didn't know their Mansi language.
Oh, no.
So that's because the winter conditions were absolutely horrifying. And what happened is often blamed on grouchy Yeti or secret alien bases, but there may be a number of explanations. So everything started getting weird from the beginning. Now, we know a lot about the early parts of this, because one of the members of the expedition was taken ill with dysentery before they got really out on the trail, and he had to come back. And that was Yuri Yeltsin. I think Yuri. I'll think of it. But anyway, he was relied on for many years as a sort of a go-to person for what might have happened, or some of the early stuff. So anyway, the 8 of them continued on, and they. The funny thing was that where the bodies were found was at Kolat Shakal, which is another native name that roughly translates as Dead Mountain. Not much better than Mount Don't Go There.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really on their route to Mount Torten, but yet that's where they went. And because in the midst of all the seminary and crazy paranormal stuff, I found time to serve in the military as well, and had survival training. And one of the first things you learn in winter operations is you never camp above the tree line if you can help it. You always camp among the trees because you have shelter there, all right? And but they didn't do that. They camped out above the tree line. And
that in and of itself is strange, because they were experienced skiers, hikers, and campers.
Very much so, yeah. And this is where it really gets fishy. So once they were settled, and of course this is several nights out. This wasn't the first night, because it took a while to get to this place. They shared a huge tent, because obviously for warmth it's good. And something apparently panicked them. And according to the evidence, they cut their way out of the tent from the inside and started to run. Not a good idea, because it was not only like 15 degrees outside. Actually, that wasn't bad for that time and the year and place.
Yeah.
But 3 to 4 foot deep snow, and most of them were not properly dressed. Some of them didn't even have shoes on. I mean, you don't do this kind of thing. So the speculation has been what frightened them enough for them to do this. So this is going, and then was well over a week before any search began, and even that didn't start. Their parents raised a ruckus with the local communist officials in Sverdlovsk, and out they went. What was interesting was that very high-ranking military officers, Soviet military officers, followed this investigation and were present at the site. The would-be rescuers, though, didn't find the abandoned camp until February 26th, way after this happened, almost the end of the month. And they didn't know anything about forensics or anything. They were mostly volunteers, no idea what to do. And they disturbed the crime scene. And then the helicopters came in, blew everything around. It was really not very good for this. But what they found when they found the bodies was really very strange. There was the slashed tent. The bodies, one of them was an older member of the group who was a World War II veteran. I mean, with what went on in the Russian front in World War II, these guys weren't afraid of anything, having gone through that. And he was frozen to death, but he also had broken ribs and internal injuries. And there was nowhere really to fall. There was Ludmila Dubinina, whose tongue and eyeballs were missing, along with a fragment of her skull and part of her lips. Now, what the hey is that about?
Yeah, what's up with that?
Well, the report later said a great deal of blood was found in her stomach, and that means that she was alive when her tongue was removed. And the report said removed, not violently torn out. And the autopsy report said the injuries were on all the bodies were caused by a quote unknown elementary force, whatever that means. So. And so this went on. Others were found because, again, frozen, but apparently two of the men had started a fire. And then one of them, including Zina Komogorova, tried to crawl back to the tent. And so there's all kinds of speculation of what actually happened here, what would cause this. Of course, Bigfoot or Yeti or Alma, as they call it there, comes to mind. Maybe didn't like them being around, were having a bad day and attacked them. But there really isn't a complete explanation for a lot of this stuff. Alien attack of some kind was also speculated or has been speculated upon because I found a number of cases where strange lights were seen over that area from people who were in other parts of the Ural region and could see the lights from where they were. So, I mean, but that doesn't really prove anything. I have a theory that may get beyond the paranormal or behind the paranormal in whatever case. And that may be that there were a lot of, this is the height of the Cold War, a lot of another thing, the bodies were highly radioactive too, which is not normal.
Good. Yeah.
No. Now, a couple of them had worked in a plant where there was a nuclear accident later on. I mean, the Soviets weren't very good at nuclear energy, okay, as far as being safe was concerned.
That's for sure.
So I think that they may have wandered into, there were a lot of secret government bases where experiments were being carried on. There was work going on in Russia at the time with sonic beam weapons, even at that early stage. And a sonic weapon could explain some of the internal injuries, although not all. But we just don't know. I think, personally, I would speculate that they were not even there on that mountainside where they were found. I think they might have stumbled into a restricted area, were, for one reason or another, killed, and the body and the tents dropped on that spot. But that raises questions, too. Why not just get rid of the bodies? You're in the middle of nowhere in this vast Soviet wilderness. Nobody's going to question when you don't come back. I mean, they'll cry and they'll question, but they won't have some big investigation that involves the military. So that is a logical inconsistency there. Why not just, get rid of the bodies? And what's the thing with poor Ludmilla having her tongue removed? And she was considered in the party to be sort of have sort of a loudmouth kind of thing, and didn't care who knew it. But I mean, that doesn't explain that. So everything about this is strange. We probably never will know much about it. There was a young man who was 12 years old who still will talk about this. Oh no, I think he died in 2004. But he saw the bodies when they were returned to Sverdlovsk, and he said that they were very abnormally dark. And the way he described it seems to me to be, unless the body had frozen, I don't want to get not necessarily vivid here, but if a body is frozen, thaws out, then freezes again, you might have the kind of coloring he described. So again, everything was weird. We don't really know what happened, but certainly we included in our section on strange places. So if you have a mountain named Don't Go There, listen.
Don't go.
Yeah, don't go.
My gosh.
It is the strangest story. I also heard that the color of their skin had turned orange.
Yeah, orange. That's the color that you described. Yeah. Now, there might be other reasons, but essentially, I think that was, something that would send up some red flags as far as radiation exposure is concerned.
That could be too. It just seems like, also the way that they cut themselves out of the tent, if they did that.
If they did that.
It's like they were insane.
Well, the tent disappeared later on.
Yeah, nobody could. Yeah, everybody said it was gone.
And the guy who had dysentery said that there was some skiing equipment that was introduced as evidence that had not been with the party when he was with it.
Oh, well, that's interesting too.
So somebody, now the Soviets weren't very swift as far as, handling investigations with any kind of forensic
I guess
ingenuity.
if you start to question them too much, they just get rid of you. So on that note, we are going to take a very short commercial break, come back and finish up talking about Dyatlov Pass, and then go on to time slips and these places that appear and disappear. Hang on to your seats, everybody. We will be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to Supernatural Girlz Radio. I'm your host.
Do you buy cottage cheese once a year and leave it in the back of your fridge? Stop that! Introducing Muna, cottage cheese that melts in your mouth and is way more exciting than Greek yogurt. Cottage cheese that's rich in protein with delicious pieces of fruit like blueberry, strawberry, and mango. Cottage cheese that comes in a snack cup and is so craveably delicious it demands front of the fridge real estate, if it even makes it to the fridge. Muna, the new way to cottage. MUUNA.com.
Patricia Baker. I am here with PK and our terrific guest tonight, Paul Eno, and he is the author of a great book, and we highly recommend it. It is called Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know is Wrong. And we're talking about, just finishing up talking about Dyatlov Pass, which is one of the wildest, strangest stories that doesn't seem to have a conclusion. And we were talking off the air about this, how there is no consistency to how these people died. And there's just so many unanswered questions. I'm hoping someday, Paul, you're going to come back on the show and answer them all for us.
Well, anything is possible. Although, for every question you answer in this field, you have 10 more, and the intelligent person realizes how much he or she doesn't know.
Yes, that's so true. Well, we've got a question for you from Trisha in our chat room, and she says, "Hi, Paul. When we describe portals as existing in a nonlinear timeline, does our timeline stay intact when these creatures cross over?"
Okay, well, Trisha, boy, we're drowning in Patricias here. I don't really use the term portals. That's not inaccurate. But again, our language isn't actually up to talking about this stuff, so you do the best you can. For me, it seems we've got intersects and overwashes. That's what we call of these worlds. Non-linear timeline. I like that term because that's how we experience it, I think. I don't know if... Well, I think one of the reasons I stood there in that Bridgeport house in 74 and with police on one side, firefighters on the other, and watched a refrigerator float is because there was an overwash of a world. There were many, many overwashes in this house of a world where our laws of gravity do not apply, at least don't apply in the same way. So our timeline does not, our timeline, as you call it, remains intact, but we are, during the overwash, the boundary has partially crossed us, in our opinion. So we are partially in the world in which, that's why we're experiencing something paranormal. And at times that's why some people will watch a UFO and other people in the same crowd won't see it. Because I think, sometimes we are partially in that world, and that's how we have the experience. If there's no intersect between ourselves and the other parallel reality, then we're not going to see or hear anything. We might feel some kind of presence. So I think I'm not sure how much the other timeline is affected, but I don't think it's really disrupted in most cases. All right.
Right.
And the question may rise, okay, well, how come, if something like Godzilla can be conceived in our minds, it must exist somewhere or somewhere in the multiverse. How come he can't come through and eat New York? Or two of us are New Englanders here, so Boston in our case.
Yeah.
Because there seem to be just a certain flow of the world families, and it's not just we exist in a bubble, but we exist in many throughout the day, but they're all related. So that when you pick up your toothbrush in the morning and you brush your teeth, okay, you're proceeding through a number of worlds in that world family where you're not going to notice really any difference. But if you drop that toothbrush, okay, you bumped over maybe into one in which you dropped the toothbrush. The one in which you didn't drop it continues. And this goes on millions and millions and millions of times every day. That's apparently how it works. And it's only when something happens to disrupt that flow that I think that you're in worlds that you have where the paranormal experiences occur, and you're partially in this one, partially in that one. But I think the world families around ours have to be rather similar, which is why I have a problem with the whole spirit thing, because this got me questioning the whole approach in the first place. You see ghosts driving cars or dressed in clothes, doing physical things. If they're spirits, this wouldn't be the case. That was my logic at the time. So I think worlds in which you could have fully yourself without your body would be very rare and rather far from our world family. And the worlds we keep bumping into would be relatively similar, except in some cases, but it depends on the case. I don't know if I've answered the question or maybe made everybody more confused. But I don't think, I don't, any kind of interaction takes place. Everything is connected. Everything is part of a great unity. So yeah, it would be affected, the other timeline, by our presence.
Well, let's talk about timelines, because you have some great stories in your book about appearing and disappearing houses and inns and restaurants. Tell us about one of those, because I was fascinated by those stories in the book.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of restaurants out there I would like to have disappeared. We start. There's, I think the first one is the Phantom House in Vermont, and I was coming out of the Bridgeport case of the previous fall, and was totally confused and didn't know what was going on. And it was the summer of '75, and I ran into two surveyors who told me the story about they were walking the meets and bounds, as they call, and they came down. They were using a government geodetic survey map where you'd have all the different buildings on the map. And this is rural area, Johnson, Vermont. And so there weren't a lot of buildings, but they happened to see a house at the bottom of this field, and there was, they hadn't been on the map, and it was really old, so somebody missed something. So they're kind of laughing at that. And they get down to the bottom, and things were strange. There were no wires coming to or from this house. There was no car in the driveway, no motor vehicles. There were some clothes hanging on a line. And the place looked like it had never been painted. As they stood in the road, it was a road Stonewall house. A very bearded man came around the side carrying an axe over his shoulder. They called to him because they wanted to know where his property line was, and he didn't seem as though he heard them. He kind of looked around, and he certainly didn't see them. So they got kind of spooked by this, and one of them told me there are still some pretty strange people in these hills. So they had an axe. They didn't want to mess around, so they kind of left. So a few days later, they're doing the actual survey, and they come down, and the house was gone. All there was an old foundation.
Gone. Nothing there.
Well, there was an old foundation, and the creeping flocks and stuff that grows around old foundations. So the town records indicated there had been a fire there in 1910, and whatever house was had burned down. So were they seeing a spirit or a spirit of a house? But I said, no, probably this is more to do with time than it is with death, certainly. I mean, none of these people shows any sign of being dead. Some of them were upset. But so that was a really strange one there. And that's something that I couldn't figure out at the time. One of the strangest ones was we actually went down in their pickup truck the next day, and I actually saw these spots, and sure enough, it was just as they said. Now, this is a number of years later. It was 1996, and I was speaking to a large group of people in Providence, Rhode Island here, and there was a woman who came up to me at the end. She seemed almost reluctant, and she took a bunch of notes out of her pocket. And the story I heard was that they had been in Utah. They were a retired couple. They were both bankers. So they weren't bumpkins, and they'd been driving in Utah. They were very interested in history, particularly ghost towns, and they found this one on the map called Woodard. And at the hotel the previous night, they said, you're not going to find anything there if you go to Woodard because it's totally deserted. There's nothing left. They said, well, maybe there'll be some artifacts, so we'll go out there anyway. Well, they headed out there, and they passed a sign suddenly that said Wilkom, like welcome, but Wilkom, or KUM, I can't remember which. And they said, that's odd. And they get to the town, and everything was weird. All the motor vehicles looked the same, and everything was written in this foreign language. And they were in this bright red van, right? So the people they turned heads as they drove in. They said, well, we're going to eat because we're hungry. So they stopped at a restaurant. The menu, nothing was in English, and they had to point to, the stuff they wanted. And they had a couple of sandwiches, which seemed normal. They went to pay, and the guy couldn't speak English. He acted like he'd never seen U.S. currency before, and he wouldn't take paper money. But they fished around for a bunch of quarters, and he took them and gave them some funny looks as they left. And they figured, this is too weird. We're going to get out of here. And she made notes of the words. And later, because I had a Dutch friend, and it turns out it was Dutch. And everybody was speculating, well, maybe this is a Mennonite community. They speak a form of Low German that sounds like Dutch, but this was not Mennonites. So they kind of went out. They drove slowly on the way out because they didn't want to end up in the Hoosgau, because who knows what that would be.
Really?
So they left, and that place has never been reported again. They got to their next hotel, and they just told somebody about this, and they were reluctant to because they thought they were nuts. And the guy looked at them like they were crazy and said, there's no such place as that. And so that's the story I got. But, you get to learn who's a fruitcake and who isn't in this field. And you can kind of judge, who is credible and who isn't. Because, when I wasn't in the military or the seminary, I was a journalist. And so you kind of learn, who's pulling your leg and who isn't. And I just got the impression these people were really sincere. So that was one of the strangest ones I ran into.
And now, do you think that's a time slip, or do you think they just slipped into another universe?
Well, it's probably the same thing. I mean, since time is entirely simultaneous, and as I say, Einstein pretty much proved that in his book Relativity, 1952, and it took everybody by surprise that he was talking about that. But he said, essentially, we experience time past the future is a function of our consciousness, because we're not quite there yet when it comes to our awareness. And some people you run into in the multiverse are, some neighbors, as I'd say, but we are not quite there yet. And when we are, you're schizophrenic, and they fill your pockets full of antipsychotic drugs.
Yeah.
And because some of the people I worked with in psychiatric hospitals as a student, these people were aware, they were in touch, they had feet on the ground, and they were experiencing several different worlds at the same time. And I'll tell you something, if that you're going to think it's a joke, but it's not. It actually happened to me. I was at the Ogdensburg State Hospital one afternoon, And the doctors, one of the doctors on call said, "You got to meet this guy. You heard of the joke of the guy who thinks he's Napoleon? This guy actually does think he's Napoleon." So I went into and the guy was very old, bedridden, and he's going on about Borodino and Waterloo and all these things. It was like he was there. So I said, "Oh, that's pretty cool." So I said at the end of the conversation, "I mean, how did you find out you were what made you think you were Napoleon?" And he said, looked at me very seriously, and he said, "God told me." Well, the guy in the next bed who'd been lying there like a lump turned around and said, "I did not." So I said, "Oh my gosh." So I said, "All right, I'll see you." So down there, and there was another goofball incident as I walked down the hallway, but then I stayed at the seminary for the following week. I couldn't take it anymore. But I mean, the knowledge and the sense of knowing in the eyes, it's just, and I've addressed groups of psychiatrists on this twice. And when you mention that maybe they're not experiencing psychoses, at least not fully, and they're experiencing, something that's really an actual existing world. The steam comes out of the ears and the eyes turn red, but they'll come up after the lecture one by one, not all of them, but a few, and say, "I've often suspected the same thing, but if I said that, I'd lose my job."
Well, that's the problem. We've talked to some psychiatrists and psychologists who also say that they now are turning their head in the direction of believing that these people are actually seeing into other universes, and they just are having a hard time telling the difference between those universes and this one. Mm-hmm. And I've heard that from shamans also, the same thing.
So have I.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so it's very interesting. But guess what? Your son, Ben, is finally here with us tonight.
Hey.
So
hi there. Sorry. You know what they say, save the best for last, I guess.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So, Ben, I just want to introduce you to everybody. This is Ben Eno, and he joined his dad's adventures in 2005 at the age of 13, demonstrating some unique insights, and at 16, becoming the youngest syndicated broadcaster in America. Ben is a sound expert and a graduate of Emerson College in Boston with a degree in audio engineering and sound design. And you are your father's partner in crime here in the paranormal. We've been having a wonderful time talking about all of these stories tonight, Ben. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Sorry I'm so late again. Work emergencies and such,
Oh, we know. This is what happens. So I hope you just heard the last part of what we're talking about, which is people being able to actually see other universes. And you've had some very unusual experiences yourself. You want to share one?
I guess you can say that. Well, I guess the one that sort of took me the longest to talk about, because I sort of like to maintain the visage of being sane, and rather than can't think of the word, compromising my my skeptical attitude, I entered into a very interesting state when we were doing our research at the Litchfield Triangle out in Connecticut, and essentially what happened was this: we were filming a pilot for the show that we were supposed to have, and then it never came to fruition. And I still haven't seen the tapes of it. My father hasn't either, because for one reason or another, it was leaned on, and they were told don't produce the show. Whatever, never heard from the guy again. So we were shooting this one portion where we were trying to find these points in this triangle in Litchfield County, Connecticut, and we got to the third point after finding the second point and triangulated the position, and we pulled up and we got out of the car. My dad was over talking with the camera guy and the director, and I went over and I saw this stone circle, and so I was like, okay, well, this is kind of weird. So I had this feeling like, oh, what if I touch this stone circle? Because there was a big stone in the middle, and there was like 4 stones on the outside, and a couple of them like forming a circle. So I touched the big stone, and then boom, big flash of light, and I like was going in and out of consciousness. I couldn't quite see, and sort of a thing I learned from one of my mentors, who was an Aztec shaman. He was like, okay, well, you got to ground yourself. And I was like, okay. So I was trying to find something to ground myself on, and I found this tree, and I put my hand on the tree, and boom, I was out like a light. And I remember very vaguely, like, going very fast in the woods. It was like I was moving incredibly quickly. And I remember seeing a big face. And then I remember waking up in the mud. So I don't know how I ended up in the mud. I don't know what happened while I was in the mud. But I was not conscious for a majority of that time.
Now, is this being filmed?
Oh,
yes. Yeah, I was right there, and the camera crew was right there, and we've never been allowed to see it. And he raised off the ground a few inches from where I was standing. And in the meantime, and we were looking for point 3 of this triangle, and these white trucks are coming and going from a point up on the hill, and this is November of 2010, coming and going from what was supposed to be a summer camp. And Ben looked at me and said, they're looking in the wrong place. They were at point 3. And a brook came down, went around this little island of stones and joined again. It was totally bizarre.
It was really funny because I remember afterwards the director was like trying to ask me questions. They were trying to do like a what happened, and they were trying to ask me what happened. And I felt like I was like electrocuted, and I like couldn't talk for like a good 20 minutes. And I was just like, I don't want to talk about this. They're like, you have to. And I was like, no, I don't want to.
I respect that.
It was horrible.
Well, I remember at Rendlesham Forest, Ben, we didn't get out of the parking lot. We were with Larry Warren, who was a witness to the 1980 case of UFO landings that happened there and strange lights. And you collapsed before we even got out of the parking lot.
Oh, that hurt too. It was like a bunch of little pebbles too.
Yeah, right. And all the dogs up and down the road started to howl, including the ones that were with us.
This is the triangle in Litchfield Hills is what you're talking about.
Oh, no, this is in England. This is
in England.
Yeah, the Rendlesham Forest, which we believe is a flap area in the triangle, because the tip of the iceberg happened in 1980 with the UFO landings witnessed by the
Yes, that was huge.
Right. But nobody talked to the local witnesses, and we gave a talk in the village of Woodbridge, which is near there. The standing room only, because it was a small room. And we went way late because we were asking, what happened to you there? Nobody talks to the local witnesses, and we got an earful about stuff that's still going on there.
Yeah, we did.
Not good.
At Rendlesham.
Yes.
Gosh. So do you think that's just a hotbed for UFO activity? What do you think's going on at Rendlesham today?
Well, again, I think it's a flap area. We believe in these flap areas where you've got multiple world intersects to an unusual degree, and the stuff just comes and goes, inadvertently or not. I mean, they see Bigfoot there. We got some pictures you wouldn't believe. They see things you can't even describe. I mean, certainly what we would call ghosts, and still lights, strange lights coming and going, and it's really still going on. So what happened in December of 80 was tip of the iceberg, and that's what got reported. There's one of the witnesses said he was downloaded. He had a binary code downloaded to him that he believes had something to do with the future of the human race and time travel and all this. But that sort of thing still goes on. We had, how many people, what was it, 4 told us that they, to this day, go and they'll have binary codes downloaded and in their minds when they come out of there. Now, because, some of these people might be fruitcakes, but we talked to an awful lot of people. Some of them have become friends, and they can't all be nuts. And I know what I saw when it comes to your stuff.
Incredible.
Well, sure. You had a firsthand experience there. I mean, both of you did. You were the observer, and Ben, you were the target, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good
word.
But no reason as to why they won't let you see the film or anything?
No, I've asked him. I think this goes back now 6-7 years. And this is a well-known director. You could look him up if I told you who he was. But no, we've never been permitted to see it. And we'd gotten to a stage where we were planning the format and the whole business. Now, most recently, there's another production company that wanted to do something with this whole flap thing, and they were going to do one season would be Litchfield, and the second season would be our Pennsylvania Triangle case, and et cetera, et cetera. They made a promo video that was, Ben, you were impressed with it. I don't know anything about this stuff, but you went to film school, so you had a good opinion of this. And Meryl Streep was in there saying, weird stuff that had happened to her, and And they from the way I heard it anyway, one of the producers told us that, who quit actually, said that they had sent out the wrong video and the networks just didn't bite. So,
that's bizarre.
So I mean, this is too.
That doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. Mm-mm. So I don't know. So somebody doesn't want this getting out. I don't know how Bill Hall managed to write his book, The Haunted House Diaries, but I said, you prepared to write 3 or 4 more books because this is only the beginning of this case.
Yeah, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
But you were investigating a 200 square mile area.
Yeah, he's been on the show a couple times talking about all these weird things, and thank God they haven't tried to shut him down. Well, here's a question for you both from Starlight. She says, wow, are you guys not scared of any of these entities you come across following the family tree?
Family tree.
Well, I
I
mean,
guess that means all of you, both of you.
Oh.
Yeah,
I'm thinking back to
connected to you.
one of our ancestors, Nicholas Disborough, who was accused of witchcraft in Hartford in the 1640.
Oh, poor guy. God.
They had a poltergeist attack on his house, stones flying through his windows, and so I guess this kind of runs in the family.
I guess so. Jeez, but so you,
no, I mean, it's just
you're not scared.
I don't know. Ben may have a different answer. When we come up,
well, I mean, scared of what?
well, after election, people come up and
These
say,
entities is what.
"Now I understand it, so I don't have to be afraid of it anymore." There are plenty of things you should be afraid of, but it's just once you got their number, when it comes to parasites, anyway, they kind of will at most of the time give you kind of a wide berth. I don't know, but we're used to this stuff. And Ben's mom and I had a long talk before we let him get involved. But he was a natural from the age of 13. I'd have him by my side anytime.
Thanks, Dad.
Oh, that's so nice.
That is what
Back in the world.
Yeah.
followed the family footsteps, huh?
Essentially.
Stepped in the attic. But and then we had the really strange. This is in the book too. Is the Spectre Leaguers of Cape Ann, Massachusetts, which we think may have been a prompt for the Salem witchcraft hysteria later that year in 1692.
Now this is the one with the guys in white. They were very spooky,
Right.
strange things to this house, trying to take over.
Well, Cotton Mather heard about that from one of our first cousins several times removed, of course, because of the distance in time, Reverend John Emerson. So we and our ancestors have our hands in a lot of this stuff. But that was really so. People were afraid that these white figures were either demons or the French, which at the time in New England wasn't much difference, So they would, but you'd shoot at them and they'd all fall over in a bunch, then stand up and walk away. None of it made any sense, and they seemed like they were just sort of having fun with the locals. And but then all of a sudden it just ended as fast as they could. Maybe they got to whoever.
Thank God it ended. Gosh.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our show. So, Paul and Ben, how can people get a hold of you, and how can they listen to your show? Why don't you do a quick announcement for everybody?
Well, sure. The start at behindtheparanormal.com. There are over 700 hours of recorded shows, if you have the time, from our 4.5 years on CBS Radio and ON 1240 in the Boston Providence area. And the show is on live, WOON 1240, Sundays, noon to 1 p.m. You can get it on various apps if you are outside of the range of the station.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on the show tonight. This has been one exciting show. Just loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you
we're going to
very
have to have you back.
Wonderful.
We barely scratched the surface with all these stories. And everybody run out and get this book, Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know is Wrong. And we'll be back next week with another exciting show, everybody. And until then, we will see you on the Blue Highway. Good night.
Good night.